Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammāṃ Saṅghāṃ Namasāmi. So, do you still have some energy left? I thought I could keep it short. I'm not sure if you can see from back there, but I'm one of the gray hairs. One of the ones who's been around for quite a long time. I had the good fortune to meet Luang and stay with him for 6 years. And then not only did I stay with him, but I made a very thorough study of Luang When I first went to Thailand, I had no interest in becoming a monk, staying very long. I just planned to go to Thailand for a 1-month meditation retreat, get enlightened, and go home. However, my plan for 1 month ended up as 9 years. I'm still working on it. I just really wanted to go to Thailand to meditate for myself, trying to get my very active mind under control. It sounds very, very logical, but when it comes to the experience, it was quite different. So I just went to a monastery in North Thailand and thought I could stay there and be in a quiet place, meditate. I'd already learned meditation in Sri Lanka in 1971. So when I was in Thailand in 1973, I just thought, okay, I just continue the practice. And after 1 month, it's all over. But the reality is a little bit more complicated. So as time went on, after about, I think, 2.5 years practicing on my own, basically, my energy began to decline. And anybody who lives in Thailand, any Westerner who lives in Thailand for, say, more than a few months, eventually hears about Luang Por and Wat Pa Pong and Ajahn Sumedho. But what I heard about them, but what happens at Wat Pa Pong, the stories there, frightened me. Getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, eating 1 meal a day, lots of hours of group practice, and having Luang Por look over your shoulder all the time. So I said, no thanks, no, I'll stay away from there. But after 2.5 years, my interest was stimulated, and it just so happened the situation arose where I could go to Ubon, visit. It was just the same year that they opened Wat Nana Chat, the international monastery. So I thought I'd just go there and just check it out, and didn't think I would stay there either. I guess I was pretty restless. Just have a look and then keep going. But when I went there, I was very pleasantly surprised because, first of all, having the teachings in English from Ajahn Sumedho was quite a revelation. I was on my own most of the time in Chiang Mai. I did have access to some English books on the Buddhist teachings. And I also had studied Buddhism when I was at university. So, of course, I thought I knew it all. But then again, when it comes to experiencing your own mind, between the theory and the practice, as T.S. Eliot would say, falls the shadow. It's quite different, the experience and the theory of it. So many kind of questions arose, many doubts, a bit of confusion arose, and the books didn't have an answer for it. So being able to go to Wat Nanachat and have a conversation with Ajahn Sumedho in English, and somebody who, from a similar culture, was a revelation. He could answer some of these questions and kind of at least clear up some of the doubts I had. I realized it's very helpful to have somebody who have access to somebody who has some experience, more experience than I did. And of course, recognizing the lifestyle there at Wat Pa Pong, Wat Nanachat, I had read the Pali Canon from the time of the Buddha, so going to Wat Pa Pong, Wat Nanachat was like, this is similar to the time of the Buddha. Monks living in a forest, practicing meditation, and walking an alms round in the morning, and looking after the monastery, living very simply. The monastery I stayed in, Chiang Mai, was a branch monastery of another very famous Thai meditation teacher and scholar, Ajahn Buddhadasa. But he was, you could say, he was a modernized teacher. He tried to present the Buddhist teachings for the 20th century. So he had in the monastery there were loudspeakers every morning at 4 o'clock. Instead of meditation, we heard a discourse from Ajahn Buddhadasa. It beamed into our huts in the forest. But I couldn't understand almost any word he said. Not only was it in Thai, but it's in Bangkok Thai, which is very sophisticated. So eventually going up to Wat Nanachat, Wat Pa Pong, and seeing the simple life there and the quiet, and it was very inspiring for me. So I thought maybe it's helpful to stay here. And then that was 1975. So that next rains retreat, Ajahn Sumedho was still at Wat Nanachat teaching. But in 1977, if you know the history, he went to live in England. So there was not, you can say, not an experienced teacher at Wat Nanachat. So in 1978, I decided I'd go and live with Ajahn Chah. There was, Ajahn Chah would come sometimes and give a talk. I didn't know Thai very well, so I had to wait for the translation. And the most frustrating thing was when Ajahn Chah would give a talk, invariably, he was a very cheerful person. He could tell some Thai puns and Thai jokes. And so the monks who spoke Thai, they would start laughing. And then we're all waiting for the translation, and it wasn't funny. I want to hear this joke in Thai. So I made an effort to learn Thai language. So that year I went to live with Ajahn Chah. I took a tape recorder with me, and I'd record his talks, go to my hut, and get out the Thai dictionary and play back the tapes and try and translate what Ajahn Chah was saying, it helped to some degree. However, he was giving talks in what we call monastic language. So a lot of the Thai was Pali language, really, not in the dictionary. So, but I trying to find out what he's saying, I went asked Ajahn Chah what he meant by some of these things, and the other monks, and so I could learn more about what Ajahn Chah was actually saying, and so it really intrigued me about who this person was, Ajahn Chah. Who's this great teacher who set up this monastery? He's inspired all these people. Who is he? What's his secret? What's his secret teaching? Once I learned that, then I could be like him. So I remember listening very carefully to what he was saying, and in the evenings, many times we'd go to his hut, and he'd be just sitting there, or he'd be talking to the monks who were there. He'd be discussing monastery business. He'd be meeting with various village people who came. And as I listened to him, I got a bit more and more confused because he was very inconsistent. He'd say one thing to one person, say something else to somebody else. I'd say, wait a minute, what's your philosophy? Don't you have a consistent philosophy? So after a while, I got more and more confused. I thought, who is this Ajahn Chah? I mean, he's very inconsistent. Maybe he has mood changes or something. And then one day, I was just sitting there listening to him, kind of give these various instructions to various people, and it just occurred to me, there is no Ajahn Chah. There's no such person, no such entity as Ajahn Chah. There is just mindfulness and wisdom functioning in the present moment. There's no person there. Huh? You get it? Yes. You got it too, huh? See, most of us build our life around me and my personality, see? So somebody says, oh, do you know that person? Oh, yes, they're the person who's like this and like that. Ajahn Chah, you couldn't do that. If you went to talk to Ajahn Chah, you had to be very mindful because you could never anticipate what he's going to answer. That's why he was a bit frightening to go near him because, and some people, I think they believed Ajahn Chah could read their mind. I don't know if he did or not, but my perception was it was more the function of mindfulness and wisdom. When somebody is so centered in awareness in the present moment, they can read you. Doesn't matter what you say, they read your body and your speech, I don't know about your mind, but they can pick up your energy if you like. And people who met Ajahn Chah could recognize he was so present. He'd stop and listen to you and really look at you, just to receive you. And when he could receive you, then he knew what you needed. He didn't have to theorize, didn't have to go into his mind and think, well, that person said that, so that person needs that. And sometime when people come to me, for example, and they ask for advice, especially if it's something like a marriage problem or something I know nothing about, so I just have to go into my mind and say, metta bhavana. Metta bhavana will cure everything. Marriage problems too, but I don't know exactly because I have the faith that metta is a very powerful meditation process. So when I realized there's no Ajahn Chah, he doesn't have any fixed position, then I could understand what was happening. One person comes to him and tells him their story, and okay, what you need is this. Like an example was, I was sitting there one time, and this man came from Bangkok, and he had a very tragic incident in his life. So he comes to Ajahn Chah and says, I want to come and be a monk and live in a monastery, and Ajahn Chah says, no, don't be a monk. Monks are just lazy. And so the man, oh, thank you very much, thank you, and he goes away. Next person comes, this local village man, and he says, I want to come and be a monk. I've been practicing the 8 precepts. My children have grown up. I've already, my wife and I have agreed we want to practice Dhamma together. And I'm ready to be a monk now. She says, yes, that's the right thing for you to do. Become a monk. But then I realized he was giving the answer to suit that person and their temperament. The person from Bangkok, who had this tragedy in his life, he was probably thinking to come to the monastery and run away from his problem, where it wouldn't resolve it. Many people, they think, oh yes, we'll go to the monastery, a peaceful place, no problems, but they forget they bring their mind with them. The problem isn't outside, the problem's in your own mind. So then when I can understand that, Ajahn Chah didn't have a fixed position, he didn't have a theory, didn't have a philosophy. He just was practicing mindfulness and wisdom. That was the real purpose and the real function of meditation practice and Buddhist practice. And one of the, as Ajahn Chah, I think, said yesterday, some of the Ajahn Chah's teachings, they're very, very simple. Like I mentioned, I studied a bit of Buddhism at university, so I knew all the theory, the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths and the three characteristics. But when it came to meditation, it didn't help me at all. In fact, many times they got in the way. As I was sitting there meditating, I think, is this the first absorption? Is this the right speech? Or is this the right thought? Is this, of course, if you start thinking about it, it's not right concentration. It's just thinking. It may be clever thinking, but it's not peacefulness of mind. But when we come to do the practice, we have a different perspective on things. So some of Ajahn Chah's teachings, I think why his teachings were had quite an appeal to Westerners, for example, was that he could really encapsulate some of the fundamental teachings of Buddhism in very, very simple teachings. Whereas, at least my mind anyway, could make it very complicated. He can make it very simple. And a couple of his teachings, which I still reflect upon to this day, probably we will never really understand, but I think are very, very crucial. You can say I would say they're the very fundamental essence of the Buddhist teachings. The first one is, everything comes from your own mind. You understand that? Very simple. But how do you relate to reality? If there's a problem, you experience a problem, is the problem in your own mind? Or it's your husband, it's your wife, it's the weather, it's the government, how many times do you actually acknowledge, the problem comes from my own mind, my own attitude, my own misunderstanding or my own ignorance? Who wants to own that? I went to university, I couldn't admit that I'm wrong. But when you understand this simple lesson, it's important to know where the source of suffering really is. It's not outside. It's in your own mind. So when you know that, then you can seek the solution to it. The source of suffering is in your own mind, so the solution of it is in your own mind too. That's where you have to look. Not outside, reading more books about it. Look at your own mind. One of Ajahn Chah's teachings he gave when I was with him at that time in Wat Pah Pong. At that time, he was becoming more well-known in Bangkok, so he had more educated people coming to visit him, some becoming monks with him temporarily. And one of the things he said was, close your book and read your mind. And I thought, how can you read your mind? What language is it? I know how to read a book, but how do you read your mind? But of course, if you're developing mindfulness being aware of body, feelings, states of mind, developing this quality of being aware of your states of mind is learning to read your own mind. And if we know that the cause of suffering is in your own mind, the solution of suffering is in your own mind, that's what you have to read, your own mind then. At first, it sounds like maybe he's anti-intellectual, but I don't think he was going that far. He was just trying to point out the fundamentals of spiritual practice or meditation practice. So when I could appreciate that, then I can read a book, but rather than looking for the answer in the book, I was watching my mind and saw what the book did to my mind. And some things, sometimes reading books, they give you a new perspective on things. But if you're watching your mind, now the mind becomes more clear. Now I'm more confused by this book. But the essence is in your own mind. That's the most important part of it, you see. And one of the second things is, this is a little bit of a hard one, I think Ajahn Theravada talked a bit about his early time at Wat Pah Pong and all the hardships. Some of the others who, when I came to Wat Pah Pong, Ajahn Chah was becoming the kind of genteel grandfather. He wasn't the tough tiger anymore. He was already 60 years old, so he was becoming the grandfather and becoming very gentle and very, very much more compassionate. I think his emphasis changed from kind of what we call endurance practice to wisdom practice. So many of his talks were reflections. Contemplate this, look at this, rather than just endure. But that was, it was a maturing, I think, in his practice. But one of the keys to the practice was that suffering is our teacher. You get that one too? Suffering is our teacher? Ouch. Or a little bit more polite way to say it is that Ajahn Chah said you learn a lot from challenges. Challenges in life, they help to sharpen the sword of wisdom. And most of us think that suffering is a nuisance, an irritation, something to be got rid of. But he could turn it around and say, no. Basically, if you're suffering, what are you attached to? What are you grasping? There's only suffering if there's grasping there. Huh? So you just follow back. If there's suffering, okay, what am I grasping? What's my ignorance about this situation? Of course, in the practice, we go to the Four Noble Truths. One of the key insights of the Buddha was that suffering has a cause. Suffering is not an ultimate reality. It's something which is caused. In order for you to resolve suffering, we need to remove the cause. Well, unfortunately, to find out the cause of suffering, you have to study the suffering. What is this suffering anyway? What is it? Why am I suffering? So it takes a careful analysis, investigation of this suffering, whatever it is, physically, mentally. And of course, the Buddha gives us the supportive qualities of concentration. Your mind is a bit more quiet and calm. You don't react so much to suffering. You don't fall into a reactive mood about it. And it's a very fundamental teaching. First of all, to look at our own mind for the source of the suffering, and then to recognize when suffering comes our way, we're given a very valuable lesson, very fundamental lesson in life. As long as it's not too kind of, earth-shattering. If it's too earth-shattering, of course, many of us can't handle it. But suffering is there in just enough of it that we can look at it, study it, investigate it. We can begin to see through it. Most of us, when we have some suffering, the first thing we do is grab hold of it and try and get rid of it, right? I call this is the glue phenomena. You grab hold of it, it sticks on your hand, and you can't get rid of it, see? But if you can just watch the suffering without interfering with it, without holding on to it, without pushing it away, just look at it, observe it, investigate it, you see that it does not have a substance to it. How much does suffering weigh? What color is it? What's its particular shape? Huh? What is this suffering anyway? Huh? Usually it's just an idea in your mind, a concept, a perception in your mind. When you really begin to look at it, you can begin to see through it. It's just an energetic. Mostly the energetic is a contraction. So if you can relax, suffering? What's the problem? Of course, easier said than done, huh? Would you like to know the simplest way to enlightenment? Anybody? Simplest way. I won't say it's not the easiest, but it's the simplest way to enlightenment. Total surrender. Huh? Again, easier said than done, but or Ajahn Chah's famous saying was, let go, let go. You can just let go. Can you just let go of suffering? Or is it so interesting, or you have so much history around it, and it's so exciting that you just dive into it? Huh? Can you just let it go? It's just suffering. If you can really look at it, just try to open to it, receive it. It's just suffering which arises and passes away. There's a sensation, there's a feeling tone, there's a state of mind, it arises and it passes away. What's the problem? We are the problem. So in the early days, before I went to Wat Pah Pong, when some of the other monks were talking about Ajahn Chah's practice of patience, patient endurance, giving long talks and things, and it was forcing us to look at suffering. And it wasn't always an easy task, but sometimes we have such a history with suffering that unless we really are forced to look at it, who'd want to see it? Huh? How many of you want to see suffering? We know that the way to resolve suffering is to release the cause of suffering. The way to find the cause of suffering is to investigate the nature of this suffering. Are you willing to investigate it? Even though you know that, huh? Very clever, you know all this, but we have a little bit of an emotional issue there, don't we? But if you can develop some degree of calmness of mind, some concentration, your mind calms down, and what calms down is your reactiveness to the suffering. Suffering arises, and some of the teachers, Ajahn Sumedho, Ajahn Theravada was just saying, when suffering arises, whatever it is, boredom. And the first thing is saying, oh, there's boredom there. Why is that? Because Luang Por Chah talks too much. Yeah, it's not my mind. It's Luang Por Chah is the problem, you see. Well, suffering's in your own mind. Yeah? But when you get to sit there for 2 or 3 hours with boredom, after a while it gets really boring to watch the boredom. Yeah? And then maybe you have to wake up. Okay, why am I suffering here? Why am I suffering with this? Huh? But fortunately, with the Buddhist teaching, especially on development of calm meditation, concentration exercises, and many people have appreciated the benefits. And nowadays, of course, it's even become quite popular that they emphasize the practice of meditation for reducing stress. Of course, they don't say, you just reduce your stress. You don't actually resolve your stress. Just reduce it. You breathe it away, just breathing, and no stress. And then as soon as you stop breathing or watching your breathing, the stress is back again. Huh? We only took 2 steps forward and 1 back. Huh? Yeah. Okay, it's a start. When you can recognize that at least stress is something which is not an ultimate reality. It can change. But if you really you're serious about resolving it, we have to study it and look into it. Find out what the real source of it is. Ajahn Chah used to give these very, very simple teachings. Another one I just remembered recently was, it's a little bit of a pun on the Thai language. It doesn't, I've got to be careful how I translate it now, he said. But he's saying, suffering is suffering, but happiness is suffering too. Tuk ben tuk, suk ben tuk. Huh? It's got a nice little poetic flavor to it, hasn't it? Huh? Happiness in Pali is sukha. Suffering is dukkha. So sukha is dukkha. You get that? It took me a while to figure that one out too. Suffering is suffering, yeah, but how is happiness suffering? Happiness is suffering because it doesn't last. You can't hold on to happiness forever. It's gratifying, but it's not everlasting, is it? So eventually passes away, and then you're frustrated, you're left resentful, whatever. Yeah. Some of these sayings are just there are themes to reflect upon, themes to contemplate, for us to understand at a deeper level of understanding. So some of these teachings that Ajahn Chah gave, I think he could really summarize some of the very basic teachings in a very, very simple way. And it gives us some themes to reflect upon in our everyday life too. Yeah. And pointing out to us, I remember when I was in Thailand, I went to Thailand, and when I first went to Thailand, I knew that, one of the key teachings of the Buddha is the Four Noble Truths: suffering, cause of suffering, cessation of suffering, the Eightfold Path. And yet, I went to Thailand, and Thailand's called the land of smiles. Why is everybody smiling if they're suffering Buddhists, Why is that? And then I went, I went back to visit Canada, and my mother asked me one time, my brother was getting married, I think it was. So she said, oh, you're a monk, you can marry people. I said, no, we don't marry people. She said, well, what do you do? I said, we just do funerals. And she said, that's terrible. She said, just funerals. Oh, that's very grim. I said, actually, it's not. Our monastery at Wat Nanachat is a cremation monastery. So we had quite a few funerals there. And it was a sad affair, but it was not really gloomy. Yeah. Of course, Buddhists, we have an afterlife, don't we? Yeah? If you don't make it this time, just come back again. You get recycled, you see. But in Christianity, you got one chance. So you either go to heaven or hell, you see. So hit or miss. Yeah. But in Buddhism, we have endless future lives, endless rebirths, you see. So you got a few chances to make it. But I realized, it wasn't a really gloomy affair. Whereas in Canada, when my grandmother died, everybody was, they're crying, and everybody dressed in black, and they wouldn't even, kind of don't look at each other, and it was like the elephant in the room. Yeah. Everybody knew about somebody died, but hush, hush, don't talk about it. I don't want to hear about it. Whereas in Thailand, because of the Buddhist meditation, reflections on death, for example, you reflect upon it, and it's not so frightening. We recognize there's an elephant in the room. It's called old age, sickness, and death, but that's the way it is, okay? When there's an elephant in the room and you don't recognize it, then you're really frightened because it might step on you. And I realized that, there was one elderly man would come to Wat Nanachat to help out in the morning to collect the monks, the rice from the monks' alms round, and he came in one morning and I saw him there, so I said, "Oh, how are you doing?" And he said, "I'm suffering." And then he laughed about it. I was really confused. Is he for real? Is he, has he been drinking already? And then he said to me, "Oh, I have Salok Sangvait." A bit hard to translate. He said, "It's Salok Sangvait." He said, I led a very unskillful life, and then I realized that I'm getting near the end of my life, so I need to devote this time to making merit, so that I have a favorable rebirth. He said, but he acknowledged, he was suffering, but there's a way out of suffering too. Huh? In the Buddhist teachings, there's a way out. In the Western countries, because people are a little bit frightened of suffering, they focus on the first noble truth. They forget there's three more. Huh? There's suffering, yeah, but there's a cause of suffering, and there's cessation of suffering too. Don't forget that. Huh? In the Pali Canon, the Buddha said one time, and somebody asked him what his teaching was, and he said, "I just teach suffering and the cessation of suffering." Those two things. Cessation of suffering, don't forget that. There's a possibility there. And then if you look into the details, the Buddha gives us the Eightfold Path. He gives us a very scientific path of practice. We say samatha kamatan, vipassana kamatan, That's what you can do. There is very, very clearly spelled out. He's given us the roadmap. All we have to do is follow it, develop it. When I first read about Buddhism, to me it was scientific. Yeah? This was not a religion. It was not some creator God you have to believe in. This was scientific. Here's a scientific way to practice, live your life, and realize awakening. All it requires was the effort, each one of us put forward the effort. That's all that was needed. And maybe there's a few little doubts once in a while, so it's helpful to have a teacher or some guidance, but it can be done. And to me, when I studied a bit about Buddhism, and then I came to practice meditation in Thailand and saw my own mind, which is very far from enlightenment, just endless chattering away in the mind and crazy thoughts, and between the theory and my own mind, it's just impossible. How can this mind ever realize enlightenment? And then I met Ajahn Chah, and there was a living example. Oh yeah, maybe it is possible. Okay, I'm not a rice farmer from northeast Thailand, but so I have a few more complications, but but here was somebody who could walk the Buddhist path. And so there was a possibility for me. So when I saw that as a living example, there was the Buddha died, passed away at Parinibbana 2,600 years ago. But here was a living example today, in the 20th century, Luang Cha. So it was possible. My own mind was practically quite far away from it, but it was a possibility anyway. And the more we do the practice, the closer we come to that goal. As Ajahn Chah says, you let go a little bit, you have a little bit of peace. You let go a lot, you have a lot of peace. You let go completely, it's called Nibbana. Simple. Just requires the practice. So when we gather together here today, you've heard quite a few different teachings, and perhaps you can recognize some common ground with all these teachings. The important part is for us to practice it. Ajahn Chah, his whole life was a life of practice. Coming from northeast Thailand, being the son of a rice farmer, the reason he could change from being a son of a rice farmer to being a very highly revered teacher with so many disciples was his own practice. That's all it requires. So he's a living example for us. And the more that we can put these teachings into practice, we will be, as it were, the real disciples of Ajahn Chah. His life will be of really real value to us personally and in the world in general. So we have this opportunity. So I encourage you to try and put these teachings into practice, and don't expect to be a big rush to the monastery tomorrow to shave your heads. However, I think Ajahn Kalyana is staying over to lead a retreat in Bubs. And there are opportunities for retreats and teachings, listen to teachings. And what I usually emphasize when I was in Europe, I was in Europe for quite a long time, in Switzerland, England, to the Western people, it's more important to do a little bit regularly, a little bit every day. Like when I was in Switzerland, the people in Switzerland, they have a very, very hectic life. They're very, very hard-working. That's why Swiss clocks work, So people would come to the monastery and do a retreat, and then they would say to me, when I get back to home on Monday morning, I'm going to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and meditate. I say, yeah, okay. So the first day, 4 o'clock. Second day, 4:15. Third day, 4:30. Next thing you know, we get a phone call, when's the next retreat? So I say, rather than being too idealistic, just try and do 5 minutes more. And more important, just to try and look in your daily life. You look in the course of your daily life, you can maybe find 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there. You're waiting for the bus, you're waiting for your friend, you're waiting for a phone call. What do you do when you're waiting there? worry, fret, get irritated and frustrated, why don't you just wait and watch your breath? Focus on your breath, calm your mind. Even for a moment, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. And if you do this through the course of the day, you have like these moments when you collect yourself. Don't let your mind go too far, become too energized, become too confused. Moment by moment, through the course of a day, you might notice, oh, if I add up all those minutes through the day, I've got half an hour. But try and find half an hour in your busy day. Sit down and meditate. In Switzerland, they can't do it. But a few minutes here, a few minutes there. And I would say it's even more valuable because you can catch your mind at these certain moments when it is starting to wander and get really anxious and frustrated. And you, anxiety. Oh, that's interesting. There's only the breathing here. What's the anxiety about? Just watch your breath. And then you're watching your breath, the anxiety can quieten down. You empower the anxiety or you power the calmness on your mind, minute by minute in your life. So if you just take these moments to collect yourself through the course of the day, at the end of the day you realize, oh, gee, I'm not so anxious, I'm not so stressed, I'm not so frustrated, whatever. And gradually begins to become part of your ordinary way of life, living with mindfulness and collectedness as an ordinary state of mind. So the possibilities are there. Ajahn Chah has given us this great inheritance, and there's still living teachers today, and all it requires is your efforts. So I wish you all the success in the future to continue with the practice, reap the results for yourself and for your friends and families and for the society today.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.